Now, to understand Jesus among the rabbis, obviously you have to understand some of the background. Who are the rabbis? What are they all about? What are their teachings? So, essentially, studying in that light will lead us to explore a little bit about ancient Judaism, Rabbinic Judaism, the origins of Rabbinic Judaism, Rabbinic literature, and all kinds of topics that are related basically to the world of the rabbis. And so, first of all, allow me to introduce this idea, what I mean when I say Jesus among the rabbis. Jesus was a rabbi. He was an itinerant teacher of God's law and wisdom among other rabbis just like him. He behaved similarly to his peers. We should expect that. He taught in various synagogues, and as was his custom, he depended on hospitality of his hosts for his livelihood, just as other itinerant rabbis did. And the method of the ancient rabbis was, by the way, to teach not standing, as you can see in this beautiful painting, but actually sitting down. And what would happen is the most earnest disciples would gather at the feet of their teacher, because essentially the rabbinic sermon and the explanation might take a while. There was no rush. The value of study, the discipline that came with that was such that anything that is worth saying is worth taking the time to say. So the rabbi would sit down and teach, and so his disciples would listen. And Jesus, as I said, taught as other teachers did, sitting down. Look at this particular passage with me briefly. This particular quote is from Mishnah, from Pirkei Avot, which is one of the earliest sections of Mishnah. Pirkei Avot is the sayings of the fathers. So this is just a little excerpt. The rabbis are saying, "Let thy house be a house of meeting for the wise, and bedust thyself with the dust of their feet, and drink with thirst their words." Now, interestingly enough, that is exactly the type of behavior that the rabbi suggests in the sayings of the fathers. We find it in the New Testament. If you look at the book of Luke with me in chapter 10, you will see this particular occurrence. A woman named Martha welcomed him, and this is talking about Jesus, into her home. She had a sister called Mary who was seated at the Lord's feet, listening to his word. Now, here's an interesting situation. We have exactly what the rabbis say, welcome the wise people into your house and sit at their feet and listen their words with thirst. And that's exactly what we see happens at Martha and Mary's house. They invite this itinerant teacher, this rabbi named Jesus, into their house. They host him, they take care of him, and they listen to every word that he has for them. I just want you to realize that this is something that happened all the time in the context of the New Testament. In Matthew chapter 5, verses 1 through 2, we read this. When Jesus saw the crowds, he went up on the mountain, and after he sat down, his disciples came to him. Now notice, as I said, the rabbis would teach sitting down. Matthew continues, he opened his mouth and began to teach them. So this is the famous Sermon on the Mount. This is the famous, one of the famous teachings in the New Testament. And so what happens here is we have Jesus come into the mountain, sitting down, the disciples gathering all around him, and when he sees that they're all gathered and they're ready to listen, that's when he begins to teach. And studying at the feet of a rabbi, or right next to the rabbi, was actually a privilege of the best and brightest pupils. They could catch every word, and that's the idea. So if you're the best pupil, you're going to have the closest seat to the rabbi, because you're going to remember everything he says and then pass it on to others. Now, there's a few verses in the Gospel of Matthew that are kind of interesting to us. because they talk about the world of the rabbis. If we want to understand Jesus as the rabbi, we have to understand the world of the rabbis. So this whole idea that I mentioned to you about sitting down and teaching has a really long tradition, a long standing. In Matthew 23, verses 2 through 3, we run across this passage. The scribes and the Pharisees have seated themselves in the chair of Moses. Therefore, all that they tell you do and observe, but do not do according to their deeds, for they say things and do not do them. Now, hopefully this is a familiar verse to you, and you have seen this before, but what I wanted to note for you is this chair of Moses. The verse is talking about Kisei Moshe in Hebrew, or Catedra de Moshe, as they would have said, mixing Aramaic and a little bit of Hebrew and Greek all together. The chair of Moses, or the seat of Moses, was actually discovered in the Chorazin synagogue. Chorazin is one of the towns in Galilee, and it contains ruins of a city or a village from about 4th or 5th century. And maybe if you visited Israel, you may have been by the Chorazin synagogue, and the ruins of this black basalt synagogue is still there. And one of the items that they interestingly found in the synagogue was a chair of Moses. And how do we know that that's a chair of Moses? Well, it actually says so on the chair. So this particular seat of Moses, and I'm showing you the photograph here, was made out of stone, and it was positioned in this particular synagogue. Best that we can tell, it was used by the one who taught the words of Moses to the congregation. So if you want to think of podiums or pulpits that are being used today for the preaching in churches, in a similar way, in the synagogue of that day, there was a special seat for the person who's going to be teaching. And so in this verse, by the way, as we read it, Jesus recognized that the scribes and the Pharisees, he recognizes them as teachers, as rabbis, the teachers of Moses. They sit in the chair of Moses because that's what they teach. And curiously enough, Jesus even tells them to listen to them. What they teach, what they tell you, he says, do and observe. So the content of their messages is based on Moses, and so they're teaching commandments. But it says just don't do like the way they do it, because they actually themselves do not follow the things that they teach. And so curiously enough, there's a little bit of an affirmation and a criticism all in one verse here in Matthew 23. I realize that Matthew 23 has been taken in a negative way a lot of times. So ladies and gentlemen, just as I continue, let me emphasize one more thing, and that the disciples of a rabbi, they memorize their mentor's teachings. When the teaching like this would happen in the synagogue in ancient days, those who gather around, and specifically the students, they would memorize the teachings of the rabbis word for word. And later they would repeat them, and they would teach them to each other. And the reason why they would repeat them to each other is because they wanted to make sure that they have everything accurate. This is one of the ways that you can make sure that you have remembered the teaching correctly, is to recite it to others who are there, and then those people can tell you whether you have it right or wrong. They may remind you of a detail or nuance you may have forgotten. So then these memorized teachings were carefully passed down to others, and of course orally, through the same exact process of teaching. They were never really written down. This is an oral culture of that day, and that's how it has been done for many generations. Now in Judaism, even today, this kind of instruction and knowledge and this particular transmission of teachings is traditional. People still practice this very method of teaching in yeshivas, and this is when people say oral Torah, the oral teaching, this is exactly what they mean. This is the oral instruction that has been passed down for generations and generations.
Shalom, I'm here to invite you to come with us on a journey of discovery into the Jewish context and culture that will forever change the way you read and interpret the Bible. As you slowly go through our self-paced, on-demand program in Jewish studies relevant for Christians, you will gain ability to discover the original meaning of the biblical texts. You will see the nuance hidden behind our best and faithful translations, and to interpret these ancient texts in their original meaning. At Israel Bible Center, we provide you with the state-of-the-art, simple-to-use technology. This way, you can study on your own from the comfort of your own home, even towards your certificate in the Jewish context and culture. This study will strengthen your ministry as you continue to serve God. We will guide you through our large collection of crash courses by our fascinating faculty and roundtable talks with leading world scholars. Our weekly Israel Bible magazine, as well as Israel Bible podcast that focuses on the land of Israel, will assist us along the way. We believe that the Bible does not need to be rewritten, but it needs to be carefully reread.
Click the link and register today to our wide variety of biblical courses.